Hey guys, we finished in the middle of a chapter yesterday, so we're just going to go ahead and continue on page 271. She sounded awful. Why? What's wrong? I'm not going to be allowed to see you anymore. Ever. Not even by accident. What if we happen to end up in the same place? I have to turn around and leave. And if I don't, Liz couldn't finish. Are you crying? I asked. No, said Liz. But she was. Marley, we were almost killed, said Liz. And not just us, but Curtis and Betty Jean and the pastor and your mother, too. There's nowhere left for us. What are you talking about? We need to find other friends, people we can actually do things with. What? Marley, I don't want you to be lonely. I want you to have friends that you can talk and laugh with, and there's no one I like at school, I wailed. Then you're not looking hard enough, said Liz. I'm not always a warm cup of milk and a dash of cinnamon. And little Jimmy is more than just apple juice. But I'm sorry. Sorry, Marley. This is just how it has to be. As long as there are people like Red in town, we just can't. I'm sorry. Are you telling me goodbye? I asked. Yes, said Liz. I am. Goodbye, Marley. And she hung up. I sat there for a full minute, staring at the receiver. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of. I went to my room and sat on my bed and thought. Looked at the problem from all angles, added all things up from all sides. I could come to only one conclusion. Liz was right. Summing people up as a cola or a coffee really wasn't fair. Most people were a whole refrigerator full of different drinks. Trying to force them into one cup or one glass meant I really never got to know them. But Liz was wrong too. As long as there were people like Red in town, it was more important than ever for us to be friends, to show all the others who were too afraid that it was possible. I needed her to point out where I was wrong, to teach me new things, and I was pretty sure that she needed me too. There had to be a way. Mr. Harding said when you are stuck, you should factor the equation. Liz was too afraid to be friends with me anymore. There had to be part of the problem I could solve, some way to give her back the courage she'd given to me. Some way, Red, he was only one part of the equation, but he was a large part. If I could deal with him, maybe it would help, at least a little. I thought and thought and thought, and by the time my parents came home that evening, I had a plan. Chapter 54. Speaking of. I explained my plan to Mother and Daddy over dinner. I didn't think they would like it much, but at least they listened. She's right about one thing, said Daddy when I was done. Something does need to be done about that Red. Mrs. Dalton isn't a bad woman, Mother agreed. Perhaps it wouldn't hurt to talk to her. Maybe we should call the police again, suggested Daddy. Mother shook her head. I had Miss Winthrop check our files. Of the police officers who live in our district, 23 signed Cross's petition. Only only 6 signed Stops. But if we all went to talk to Daltons together, Daddy nodded. It's worth a try. So 20 minutes later, my parents and I were knocking on JT's front door. A colored man wearing a butler's uniform answered the door. We were hoping to pay a call to Mr. and Mrs. Dalton, said Mother. Are they home? The man nodded and ushered us inside. I still had the black feather. It was bent and crumpled, and now Liz wasn't talking to me. I wasn't sure it had any magic anymore. But it made me feel better as the man led us down the hall and out onto the back porch. Mr. Dalton was holding a drink and reading a paper. JT and Red were on the lawn, tossing a football back and forth. Mrs. Dalton sat in the corner, sipping an iced tea and reading a book. JT dropped the football when he saw us. Mr. Nisbet, Mr. Dalton said, what do we do to gain the pleasure of this visit? His voice made it clear it wasn't anything but a pleasure. It was anything but a pleasure. Mr. Dalton, said Daddy, I'm not sure you are aware of recent events involving your son, Raymond Edward Dalton. I'd always wondered where Red got his nickname, since he didn't have red hair. It was silly when parents give their kids names that they had initials that spelled words like Daisy, Ursula, Montgomery, or Peter, Ivan, Galveston, or... No, I wouldn't drift off. I was going to listen. Listen to every word, until it was time to do my part. And then I would talk. The police were already here this morning, said Mr. Dalton. Again. We all turned to look at Red, but he stood still, as calm as can be. It was JT who looked afraid. I wondered, for the first time, what it would be like to have an older brother like Red. Someone you loved because they were your own flesh and blood, but someone who was nasty too. Sometimes even horrible to you. And I remembered how, when JT was in third grade, he fell out of his treehouse and broke his leg. At least that's what they said. But I remember being surprised because it was a nice treehouse with walls all around the top. If you were clumsy, maybe you could fall out, but JT wasn't clumsy. If your brother was mad at you, though, it'd really be easy to push you out. JT had been in the hospital a long time. Mother even took Sally and me to see him. I was nervous because even then, JT was something of a golden boy, the alpha lion of the pack. Sally chattered a blue streak. I put a vase of daffodils from our garden on the window. Everyone said the doctor did a fabulous job and that his leg healed perfectly, but that wasn't true. After a long day of school, sometimes, maybe if it was about to rain, JT had a slight limp. Once last year, coming off the football field, I saw him rubbing his hip when he thought no one was watching. Everyone assumed he wanted to be just like his brother. But what if he didn't? What if he'd rather be someone else? The police came to talk to my son, repeated Mr. Dalton, pulling me out of my own thoughts again. And they accused him of throwing a bomb through a poor Negro's front window. Now I assured them my son would never waste his time on such a prank, and seeing as how there was no evidence anyway, the good officer agreed and apologized for wasting our time. So what I'm wondering is, why are you all here to bring this up again? The father would be no help. Our daughter was trapped in the trunk of your son's car while she was removing the dynamite Red had stored there. Mother's voice was calm and clear, but her hands were shaking. My son never stored dynamite in the trunk of his car, said Mr. Dalton, though he did recently have a lock broken off. Had to get a new one installed. I don't suppose your daughter would know anything about that? I counted 2, 3, 5, and said, yes, I do. For the first time, Mr. Dalton looked surprised. I broke it off with a letter opener, I continued. I'll pay for the lock, but I like the opener back. Uh-oh, she began to talk. Watch out. Mr. Dalton looked up from her book. Mrs. Dalton. JT almost smiled. Red had absolutely no reaction at all. Thought you were mute, said Mr. Dalton. No, sir, I said. But as I said, I left the opener in the trunk, and I'd like it back. Well, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Get out of here, all of you. And if I ever hear one word about this again, I'll have you arrested for slander. Mrs. Dalton stirred her tall iced tea. Thought of the time we'd spent together stuffing envelopes. I waited for her to say something, but she didn't. The butler held the door open for my father. Out! Mr. Dalton barked again. I began to see why Red had turned out the way he had. I looked over at JT. Please, I whispered. JT held my gaze for a long time, then went over to his mother and touched her arm. Mama, he said, Marley is a square, but she's not a liar. Red turned as red as his name. Mrs. Dalton reached up and ran her fingertips across her scar. Go, said Mr. Dalton. Mother took my arm and started to lead me off. No, said Mrs. Dalton. She rose from her seat, clutching JT's hand. What? Snapped Mr. Dalton. I'd like to see if this girl is telling the truth. Why? Asked Mr. Dalton. It's a simple matter to check. Mrs. Dalton's voice was growing stronger. Let's go look in the trunk of Red's car. If there's a letter opener in there, I'll believe her story. If not, you can call the police. Red shrugged, and I suddenly had the awful feeling that he had already found the letter opener and thrown it away. But maybe he had only found the handle. Maybe the blade was still there. Mr. Dalton sighed. Fine, let's go settle this once and for all. But afterwards, you have 1 minute to get off my property before I call the police. So we marched back to the house and got to the car in the driveway. Mr. Dalton glanced at Red, and he unlocked the trunk without protest. We all cried around to look inside. There was nothing there. Mrs. Dalton sighed in relief. Red grinned. Mr. Dalton just crossed his arms. Satisfied, he snapped. I wasn't. I knew it had been Red. And before anyone could stop me, I jumped back into the trunk. Get your crazy daughter out of my... Daddy held the lid open so I wouldn't get trapped. I bent down, pulled back the lining of the trunk. There, in a crack in the side, something silver flashed. I reached in and pulled out a slip of metal. Daddy helped me out of the trunk, and I held it up. Mr. Dalton clenched his teeth. Red, what is the meaning of this? It's just a piece of metal, said Red with a shrug. I don't know where it came from. I turned the metal so they could see my name. Engraved in the blade. shining yellow in the setting sun. Red lunged at me, trying to grab it away, but his own father held him back. Red broke free and spat on the ground. Mr. Dalton's face was bright red. What the blank were you thinking? I didn't know they were going to be there, snapped Red. I was only after the colored girl. I saw her go into the house and thought that was where she lived. You said yourself she deserved. Shut up, roared Mr. Dalton. Get in the house before. No, said Red. His bangs fell into his eyes and he pouted. It made him look like about 5 years old. I'm still bigger than you, boy, said Mr. Dalton, and there's a switch in the back closet I'm not afraid to use. Red's eyes blazed with hatred and turned and slunk into the house. Mr. Dalton followed him without even glancing at the rest of us. Mother, Daddy, JT, Mrs. Dalton and I were left standing awkwardly on the sidewalk. Finally, Daddy cleared his throat. I'm afraid we're going to have to call the police. Mrs. Dalton nodded. I know. JT was staring at the ground. I walked over to him. You okay, JT? He looked as shocked as I'd felt after the bombing. No, he said. I never really thought he'd do it. I took his hand and he held it for a moment. Come on, Marlies, said Mother. It's time to go. Last days of school. We were silent most of the way home. I didn't mind. After seeing JT's parents, his father so angry and vicious, and his mother as passive as a wallflower, my family's little spat seemed like a child's game. Daddy was just turning onto our street when we said, "We need to talk about your punishment." I'd say she deserves to be grounded until the end of the school year, said Mother. That's fair, I admitted. Actually, that was more than fair. The end of the year was only 2 weeks away. I expected worse. Marley, said Daddy, taking a dynamite from Red, was reckless and impulsive. I nodded. But it was awfully brave, too. He almost sounded proud of me. Marley listens to lions, said Mother. And Daddy didn't even ask what she meant. I guess somehow he knew. I tried calling Liz again the next morning, but her number had been disconnected. Even though I knew it wasn't fair of me, I suddenly hated Liz's mother. On the last day of school, JT came up to me while I was cleaning out my locker. Red's gone, he said. I nodded. I wasn't sure what to say. There wasn't enough evidence to charge him with the crime, JT explained, but my father made him join the army. He's only 17, so my dad had to sign an extra form, but he's gone. I'm sorry, I said. No, said JT. I'm glad. Things are a lot better at home. Mother's not having so many headaches, and he stopped. But I miss him too. Isn't that stupid? I shook my head. Anyway, said JT, I told Mr. Harding I'd been cheating in math, and I should probably repeat his class next year. I didn't want to tell him you were the one helping me and get you in trouble, but it's okay, JT. He already knew. JT shook his head. Oops, where did I just go to? With Red gone, I'm trying to make a fresh start. Do things the right way, you know? But admitting when you've done something wrong, he shivered. It makes my skin crawl. How do you stand it? I shrugged. You sleep better at night. Well, that would be nice. JT gave me a funny look. You don't want to go to the movies with me sometime, do you, Marley? There it was. JT finally asked me on a real date. After all, this time. No, JT, I said as gently as I could. I don't think so. Okay, he said. No hard feelings. Good. And I meant it. Hey, do you think Sally would say yes if I asked her? I smiled. She'd love it. Sure enough, by lunchtime, Sally was over the moon. I never knew you could talk about a two-sentence conversation. Want to go to the movie sometime? Sure, for 20 minutes. Nora and I glanced at each other. She rolled her eyes and I tried not to giggle. I'd never really gotten to know Nora. I'd always thought of her as Sally's sidekick, never as being her own person too. Little Jimmy sat at our table and I thought about what Liz had said to me on the phone, about us meeting other friends, ones that we are allowed to see. Hey Jimmy, I said, you in the pool this summer? Yes. My stomach gave me a funny little lurch. Never thought I'd be asking him out. Maybe I'll see you there? That'd be great, he said. We could jump off the high dive. Sure, I said automatically. Then I wanted to kick myself. I didn't want to jump off the high dive. Great, said little Jimmy. The bell rang and he started to walk off. I was stupid and dumb and never learned. And one step at a time. If I didn't know what to do, I should factor the equation. Jimmy, he stopped and turned. Actually, I counted 2, 3, 5. I don't like the high dive. Oh, he said. How about I buy you a Coke from the snack bar instead? That'd be nice. He nodded and walked off. It was funny because little Jimmy hadn't grown a bit, but now when I looked at him, he seemed kind of cute. I wasn't thinking about getting married or having kids or anything like that at all. Just about sharing a Coke with a friend on this hot summer day. Maybe Liz was right after all.